great reminder that the largest plot of publicly owned land in any city is the collective area of the streets, right? That is publicly owned. We typically call the space between one lot and another lot in which a street passes through the right of way. And that is measurable when we look at the land allotments or the land parcels map in Beacon. We can measure between two lots and see the precise measurement of what the right of way is. It just happens so that in the past 60, 70 years that right of way has been primarily for automobiles. It wasn't always that way, as we know from our historic imagery from the slides previous. But there have been opportunities and situations where reclaiming that that portion of the street back to human use or pedestrian use or otherwise becomes more advantageous for the business owner, and perhaps even much more now during COVID-19. We're completely rethinking about how much land we are giving over to the automobile, particularly now that we need more space in order to conduct business successfully. And so those little moments in Muncie life where people can take back a portion of the street and enjoy it for more than one purpose of storing their automobile has certainly been a cause for celebration in the past few years. By the way, this is Christine Ryan's husband is right there. He's the best living bass player I've ever met. So do say hello to Paul sometime, and if you want to take bass lessons, take them from Paul. He's a master. So you might recognize this is the alley between the Fickle Peach and the DeFerveran Law Office. That is what was the patio in front of the Fickle Peach. They basically have made an agreement now just to take over the entire alley because for the need for social distancing. And so, by the way, these two columns, those granite columns, are from the McNaughton building, which used to occupy the site where DeFerveran is. You probably remember that from postcard imagery or historic imagery. Into the night, it's these opportunities to reclaim the streets or reclaim the alleys are special to us. This particular alley, because it's shaded from the sun and because it grabs breezes coming off of the park, it's really can be quite pleasant. But there are other smaller, what we call tactical urbanism examples, or tactical examples of reclaiming portions of the streets for public life or for social life. A few cities across the world have rolled out pianos into the sidewalks or into the streets. This is my hometown of Mount Pleasant, Michigan, that did a piano program. We have a fantastic non-for-profit arts organization called Art Reach of Mid-Michigan that does tremendous things and has a summer-long arts festival that involves lots of chalk painting and smaller events. As opposed to one big event, they elected to do a series of smaller events. Now, why someone would walk on that, I don't know, but oh my goodness, but man.
So is your town the one that does like that kind of the chalk art on the ground? It looks like it's like 3D or whatever?
It brings a few competitive artists, yes, but Fort Wayne is a really good one close by. They have a big chalk art festival next to the Museum of Art. And then once a year, the primary intersection in my hometown's downtown, they repaint. They have a competition, first of all, to repaint the image of the intersection, and then they get about 50, 60 volunteers out there on a Saturday morning, and it's done. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's done. So that's another example of a tactical urbanism situation where citizens can come together and change their built environment in a faster, cheaper, more deployable sort of way. Others involve more sponsorship or more expense. The Marilyn Glick Cultural Trail in Indianapolis is a collection of fantastic outdoor art, outdoor sculpture, interactive art. This is actually a portion of Virginia Avenue that passes through a parking garage. Okay, well, so between downtown and Fletcher Place, and then Fountain Square, two of my favorite neighborhoods in Indianapolis are Fletcher Place and Fountain Square, are all along Virginia Avenue, which is the southeast spoke coming out of the Monument Circle. When Bankers Life Fieldhouse for the Pacers was built, it needed a structured parking garage. So they built it right over Virginia Street. Well, in doing that, they decided to weave the cultural trail from the downtown towards Fountain Square. So they created these opportunities for some more public art, interactive art. So this sculpture casts colored light onto the garage and onto the sidewalk surface. And then there are sensors in the sidewalk. As people walk over the sensors, it activates the lights. And so it becomes an interactive experience. That photo does not do it justice, obviously, because it's in the middle of the day. But at night, that is a great experience. Rundell Ernstberger was the landscape architect that did the cultural trail and did these smaller installations along it, what we call the Marilyn Glick Peace Walk, that honors several figures in history. This is all etched glass, fantastically etched glass. It's sandblasted to create a portrait image. And then at night, they light it from below, and it shines up, and it's really stunning portrait of Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr., and other American figures that are small installations along the cultural trail that provide a place to sit, a little bit of history there, a little bit of lighting, just as a small tactical piece of landscape architecture that allows us to have a break and learn something while we're walking along the trail. Larger portions of Indianapolis that have given over and started to rethink sort of the right-of-way include Georgia Street. Georgia Street is not a pedestrianized street between Baker's Life Fieldhouse and the Convention Center, but it is a hybrid street in that we can plug in stuff into the street. We can plug in gas-fired burners. We can plug in electricity. All of that's kind of embedded into that portion. And then during the typical regular business day, like it's pictured here, cars can pass through and cars can actually park there. So, but on a festival situation, NCAA, Super Bowl, all of this then becomes pedestrianized. So it has that hybrid flexibility of being an event street during those times, but being a very regular street during the other times. So here we are on a 100-degree day in July, so not much happening there at all, but still a pleasant walk nonetheless. And then during Super Bowl, we went on a Monday night, and LMFAO was playing at one end. There was a zip line at the other end. There were 40,000 people on this street on a Monday night, just leading up to Super Bowl. But that's what Super Bowl does. It's basically a week-long festival of events and a lot of light beer being consumed. But I have never seen, for folks like me who've been around here for 26 years, we've never seen that kind of pedestrian activity in Indianapolis ever before. So now in Brooklyn, this is called Friday night. so that is a different situation, different density. But Indianapolis hosted the Super Bowl for the first time in 2010, where the Giants beat the Patriots and defeated Tom Brady and the evil empire of Bill Belichick. And folks from all over the world started to call this the Indianapolis model for hosting an event. Nowhere before had sports journalists and media and NFL officials ever said that they could walk to everything. Not ever before have they been able to have a Super Bowl where they could use the phrase, I could walk to everything. That's pretty amazing for Indianapolis, yeah.
How much of that was actually like permanent infrastructure though, versus like how much of that was like you can go there now and walk it when it's not shut down for 40,000 people?
If you go there and walk it now, it'll look like that.
I mean, is it just Georgia Street or everything
Yeah.
else down there?
That's it. everything else is again temporary. A lot of that is temporary. Pan Am Plaza is connected to this. That was built for the Pan Am Games in 1987, the other large worldwide event that Indianapolis hosted in the last generation. And that's large part and parcel. That infrastructure is still kind of there too because of the Pan Am Games that were hosted there. But what we call permanent infrastructure is, of course, sewage and water, electricity, and gas, but also hotel rooms, also the convention center, also the arena, being placed together in this fashion. Because if the arena had been placed in Fishers, or the convention center had been placed on 465, none of this would have happened this way, right? All of that would have been driving distance. And anytime the Super Bowl is held in Jacksonville or Miami or Dallas, there's 45 minutes there, hour there, half an hour there by car. Everything in Indy was walkable.
So I was living in Browardville at the time, and additionally, Indianapolis really ramped up public transit.
Yes.
So it did make it like much easier for
Yep.
anyone to get in from like the outside.
The other thing Indy does well is volunteers. They have armies of volunteers. Yes.
I was just gonna say, I went to that when I was
Yep.
a kid.
Yep.
It was really cool.
So the entire convention center that week was one exhibit. It was called the NFL Experience. And just the entire convention center was full of different exhibits, from memorabilia, jerseys, rings. I mean, the interactive games for kids, and then vendors. So I'd never seen the convention center 100% full before. So those are that sort of thing. And then this was the zip line on Senate Street, or Capitol, right on Capitol. And so every few seconds there would be people zip lining above you. So very memorable experience. So, but it's a good reminder that we do, especially in the time of social distancing now, we do see and do want to be seen, and the level of isolation and loneliness people are experiencing now in quarantine is certainly contradictory to what our human nature might be. This is the famous Venice Beach rollerblader. He's been a street performer now for the last 40 years or so. But Venice Beach was one of the great examples where a pedestrianized environment told us that kind of carnival or street fair kind of atmosphere was something that people actually liked. But nobody had really committed numbers to paper in terms of what that meant for design. Nobody really said people like outdoor space. Architects and landscape architects just kind of did what they wanted to do based on principle and based on aesthetics, not what human behavior was. So William White at Columbia University with his students started to record how people actually used public space. It's the first time we had some numbers that indicated how public space was actually being used by people in New York. And how if you watch how people behave and where they sit and where they like to go and where they don't like to go, that might actually create some design criteria for us. First time that had been committed to paper. So he and his students started to map where and how people used public space in New York. And so many of these names don't mean much to us anymore because those are corporations that are no longer with us. But when it comes to some of the outdoor space like Greenacre Park and Paley Park, those were funded by the Vanderbilt's, great small public spaces in New York, and then other larger buildings like Lever House and Seagram Building. By actually mapping where people sat, they liked the sun, how they sat. This is not sittable space, but they occupied it anyway. We started to get a sense of how people might want to use public space if they had the chance to do it, and that access to food, access to water, access to the sun, and access to being able to see each other is a great collection of films that he and his students film. That's a camera, film camera, in a book called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces and a film series called The Social Life of Urban Spaces. There are segments of that available on YouTube. I recommend them. They are timeless, even though they were filmed in the late 60s and early 70s. They are timeless in terms of what they tell us. Alan Jacobs was an urban designer that practiced out of Berkeley, taught at Berkeley for 40 or so years. He and his students decided to walk, map, measure, and draw the great streets of the world. Because he and his students thought, well, if we make drawings of them, then we can maybe learn something from them. When we understand their measurements, their proportions, and their relationship to the human scale. So he and his students traveled the world and found the great celebrated streets, avenues, and boulevards of the world and started to make drawings of them. So this is a first floor plan, cut away, so we remove all the upper floors. We include the cast shadows from the buildings onto the street. We include the columns, all of that. So this is a portion of Venice where we have streets called colonnades, where you're actually walking underneath the abscess of the first floor. So the street is actually completely sheltered by a portion of the building and then separated only with a column. But it creates protection from the rain and also creates protection from the sun. It's a type of sidewalk that you often see in Italian and Mediterranean rim cities. And then there's two, you can see the cast shadows here. Those are two monuments casting onto the street itself. So these were all ink on Mylar drawings, measured drawings, drawn to scale. Places like, well, Champs-Élysées in Paris, the La Ramblas in Barcelona, pacing them off, measuring them off, creating these plan view drawings looking straight down, looking at the trees and the drive lanes and the measurements of the sidewalks, but also drawing cross sections through the street that started to talk about the public realm being that first floor and how that bleeds into the interiors of buildings, and then drawing perspectives based on photographs, again, all ink on Mylar drawings that this book called Great Streets is still a reference for urban planners and designers today. For them, a canal was a street. So this is the Rialto Bridge in Venice, and so a canal is just another street. So they measured these distances in the canals and continued to create maps, mapping style diagrams as well as plan view diagrams and perspective images of those, with the idea being we need to record this so that we can learn from it. If we're going to design great streets in the future, we probably should know something about the great streets of the past. So it's something that he and his students, over a period of years, committed to paper so that we could understand the measurements and proportions of what made these streets great. He and his students also identified that there were different types of streets. A muse street. In Britain, we call that a muse. It's a residential street that cars are allowed, but they're not penetrating very often. And so they're primarily pedestrianized streets that are off of a main drag, or off of a high street, or off of a boulevard, or off of an avenue. And he also committed to what those words meant. What is a boulevard? What is an avenue? What does that mean physically? Here in the United States, we just assign those names to anything, right? But if you look at where that type of street originated, it actually has some meaning for the physical nature of what the street is. The boulevard has trees in the middle of it, for instance. So we mess all that up here. Although in Indiana we do have something called a pike, right? Pendleton Pike, Bethel Pike. We know what a pike is. A pike is.
Oh, that's like a toll road back when the country was
Yes,
founded.
correct. Yeah, it was a toll road. Yeah, but here in Indiana, it's typically a diagonal connector between one village and another. So they're named for the villages that they actually connect to. And so Bethel Pike, Pendleton Pike. Yes, but that was, yeah. A pike is also a fish, but sometimes the words do mean something. Another thing that Professor Jacobs and his students did was create these figure field diagrams or figure ground diagrams of great world cities, because at this different scale, this zoomed out scale, they always did 1 square mile, exactly 1 square mile of each of these world cities, and just mapped the street area versus the non-street area. And what they discovered was if you looked at a square mile of every world city, it would teach you something about what that city meant. Every city has its own unique form. And so if you understand the city form, and you understand the city pattern, it starts to tell you about something about that city. Comparing Aix-en-Provence to Barcelona tells you something about that portion of the city at a certain time. Aix-en-Provence had a medieval wall. So you can see the remnants of that wall, of that defensive perimeter. Barcelona was, this portion of Barcelona is called the Example. It was built in the latter part of the 18th century and was built around public health principles, which led to planning principles at basically the beginning of the first form-based code. It's one of the most interesting parts of Barcelona because it's very repetitive, with the exception of these diagonals that run through it. So if you haven't been to Barcelona, do recommend it. Very interesting portion of that. But again, if you just 1 square mile, that covers most of the medieval portion of Amsterdam, the inner ring of the canals, and most of the older portion of Ahmedabad. But these are entirely different city forms in terms of the proportionality of built versus unbuilt. in terms of the proportionality of canal to street to building. And so these diagrams start to tell us something about what makes these cities different. And then you get to the automobile era. Brasilia, the planned capital of Brazil, centered around the automobile, or suburban LA, Irvine. That could be Carmel. Then a very, very different situation entirely, because the automobile changed everything in terms of how things were spaced, proportioned, and how much space was given over to the car. And again, 1 square mile tells you a lot about the livability and the scalability, the human scale of something. All of you should go to Savannah, by the way. I mean, you can walk across Savannah in an hour. That's probably 1 hour, although there's thousands of interesting things to look at. But that city grid of Savannah, where each of those squares has a different identity entirely, versus Cairo. And how they grouped them together was interesting as well. But that every city has its own unique form, its own unique relationship to a geographic element like water or mountain. Perhaps an interesting relationship to what a grid is in terms of how that shapes allotments and land and otherwise. And then the tight city grid of New York. That's Columbus Circle there, right in the southwest corner of Central Park. So this is Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue running there, and then Broadway running into Columbus Circle. Another book from David Suker. He's not a designer, he was a lawyer, but he just discovered that living in Seattle, that some neighborhoods in Seattle were cool and some were not. And so he started to put together examples of things that made things interesting and cool. And Seattle, for a while, put their city map on utility covers. Oh, cool. Okay, so starting to combine utility and livability. The Fremont Street Troll, which over 1 million people visit per year. The Fremont Highway divides Fremont, the hippie neighborhood of Seattle, from the downtown. But so they said, let's put a troll under the bridge. Why not? Trolls live under bridges. And instead of a highway viaduct being an unlivable place or unwelcoming place, the troll then attracts 1 million visitors a year. So Suker is just looking for these simple livability rules or sociability rules that he thought made urban neighborhoods cooler than others, and wrote them in a way that some are very physically tangible and some are not. Allow strangers to sit together. Build close to the sidewalk. Simple things like that. I mean, when Starbucks changed their furniture plan and allowed strangers to sit together pre-COVID, then that changed the social life entirely of the business. And so if you've been to places where strangers can sit together, it's a totally different culture of a business than not. And you go to Germany and the beer halls, that's pretty normal. There's just big picnic tables where everybody just sits together. And it's very indicative of a different type of culture. The other thing is the relationship to the car. He started to notice that if we can change the relationship of the sociability of the street to the car, then we can change everything. And that's simply tucking in parking in the rear as opposed to parking in the front. And so his books are just examples of interesting, creative ways of tucking the car away across primarily the Pacific Northwest. So his books are out of print now, but they primarily focused on Seattle, Vancouver, Oregon coast, Cascadia, that area. But he commissioned somebody to do some drawings for him that start to diagram some of these creative, interesting ways of dealing with the car to not reduce the sociability of the street. And his simple notion is just put it in the back. Build closer to the sidewalk and put the parking in the back. He also started to look at ways of creating neighborhood streets that were more inviting. So he started to diagram this notion of the bump out or the bulb out that shortens the crossing distance so that kids and elderly can actually safely cross the street, and it gives up maybe 1 parking space. You also have that space left over for stormwater drainage, plants, additional restaurant seating. Again, this is very typical now for our new Muncie downtown. It's very typical for around the Cultural Trail, but this was considered pretty revolutionary 20 years ago to give up a parking space for somebody. Or to actually street calming devices, traffic calming devices that actually slow down the speeds in residential streets, kid-friendly streets, so you don't have speeding cars. Well, these also catch speeding cars, which can be quite practical. How wide do you make a sidewalk? The answer is it depends. Busy areas, busier sidewalks, you should make wider. Not busy areas, you can make it smaller. Tell that to people in Broad Ripple where the sidewalk is only 3 feet wide and you're practically stumbling into 3 lanes of traffic. So that all has to be rethought because, again, we've given priority to the car, not to people. And in pedestrian-friendly, intense districts like Broad Ripple, we need to rethink the space of the sidewalk. But the answer is it depends how busy it is. In Muncie, the sidewalk width is determined by the ability for a wheelchair to pass by something safely. So our entire street design was around an ADA-based lawsuit from folks in wheelchairs who argued that they could not access businesses in downtown Muncie because of the way the street was designed. So the net effect of how our street is designed now deals with the safe passing distance or safe width of a wheelchair being able to pass safely. Yes?
So there's still a lot of areas like in downtown Indianapolis
Yep.
even where like there's like a 3 foot at most
Yep.
wide sidewalk with
Yep.
like telephone poles right through the middle of it.
Yes.
Like how does that still stand like 30 years after like the ADA?
Someone should sue. someone could sue and should sue. But yes, but that's the type of negligence that is professional negligence in terms of where utilities and the car width and all those things come together. Or must we have a parking space here? That sort of questions. But it was a single person's lawsuit that made change. Yes. Parking Day just happened. International Parking Day. This is an international movement. International movement that started in San Francisco 20 years ago. And it is an example of tactical urbanism, social activism, where folks come together and say, we're going to rethink this parking space. Typically one parking space, sometimes 2 parking spaces in our cities, and show the world how we can use this space differently. And it started as a guerrilla tactic, a guerrilla urbanism tactic, a form of social protest. Folks would just feed the parking meter for the day and then put in an installation. Yes, this is how it started. They would just feed the parking meter and then build something in that one parking space, and then start to show that the relationship to the sidewalk, buildings, the street, restaurants, businesses was suddenly that much better because of the amount of sittable space and human occupiable space that was given over to 1 or 2 cars. Yes.
Yeah, this looks like almost like Mass Ave.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
How they have like some parking space.
Correct. But it started as a social activism movement, and it spread throughout the world. I think yesterday was officially International Parking Day. So the nonprofit, non-centralized organization that started this is now mapping every instance of where this happens around the world. So that's that's Wayne Street. So that's Morrison, Catman, Menzie builds one every year in the 2 parking spaces that are in front of their office. So that's Wayne Street in downtown Fort Wayne. So they take all this stuff and they store it and then they reinstall it every year. They have lunch outside and have a good time. Very typical. This is in Hell's Kitchen. Very appropriate utilitarian situation where bikes and pedestrians outnumber the cars, and so a small bodega like this can actually have 300 to 400 square feet of extra sitting space. It works very, very well. And then screen it with some flowers or with a little bit of fencing. And you completely forget that it's a parking space. And it reopens our awareness of the sidewalk and folks can walk by. It's just a great example. This was very close to the Javits Center. So we had the APA convention at the Javits Center. All of our hotels were typically probably at Times Square. And so little instances like this between Times Square and Javits Center were interesting. Back to my hometown. The local coffee shop said, no, we don't need these 2 parking spaces. We need outdoor seating. So they petitioned the city to say, we will build and maintain our outdoor seating provided that we can have 2 parking spaces. And as you can see, this is Broadway. A lot of Midwestern cities adopted New York or Philadelphia street names, worth mentioning. But you can see it's diagonal on one side and parallel on the other. But the 2 diagonals there, they built a wood deck, and in order to accommodate ADA, they have that small ramp. Now, that, according to Michigan barrier-free guidelines, that is legal. But in other states, that would be illegal because you cannot detect that with the cane until it's too late. It can cause a traffic hazard. So different regulation or different interpretation of ADA from state to state can lead to that. I mean, I almost tripped on it myself. So if you're looking at your phone, you're like, whoa! But this is how this coffee shop was able to increase its sales by arguing that we need more the outdoor seating more than we need the parking. So that's a temporary installation that they install and reinstall every year. So they take it down in October, put it in storage, snow. Michigan has snow, and then they reinstall it every spring. Yes.
Do any of these parklets ever like become permanent?
Yes. Yeah, they do. In some cases, yes. If they become so popular that they become, yes, they become permanent. Just down the street, you can't see it, but these 4 trees here, there actually is a permanent parklet there because that business had been around for 30 years and said we want outdoor seating permanent. So that those 4 trees you see in the background have a permanent parklet in front of them. Yeah. So that became a permanent part of the street design. Incidentally, Broadway Street in my hometown has been pedestrian all summer long. Every 2 weeks they renew it. So they're because the businesses on Broadway Street say we need the space. Otherwise, we're going to go out of business. So social distancing and COVID have changed that relationship. Parking is in the rear. On both sides of this street, there is ample parking in the rear lots. And you just connect to the main street through either alleys, through the businesses themselves, or from the side streets. So that's another situation where the parking is already kind of established in the rear. So you don't need all this parking on the main street. And you can see that the sushi restaurant across the street also has a temporary installation that they can place on a single parking space. This is the permanent one just down the street. So because the deli on the right had been around for 30 years, they just argued that they wanted outdoor seating, so it became permanent. And then this is the sushi restaurant across the street. That is temporary. It's basically kit of parts. They put it up in the spring, they take it down in the fall. And the business would not survive without it. I mean, they need that extra seating because the more seating you have, the more customers you can serve. So this is parking day a couple of years ago, right here at CAP, just taking over 3 parking spaces, the 3 metered spaces there. So another example of student activism, just raising awareness about parking day. So it didn't happen this year, unfortunately, but there have been efforts where student activism can raise awareness around International Parking Day, and then feed the meter all day long, or get a permit to close the meters. Much of what are there any standards that give you guidelines for how to do this? Well, they've all been centered around what we call NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials. And their free PDF guides are gold, absolute gold. So I recommend you download these, get them into your personal digital library, because all of this wisdom of what works and doesn't work is now being studied and centered into a research consortium at NACTO, and then their guides have become the gold standard because, again, 20 years ago, nobody knew how to do any of this. They were just really nice pop-up examples around the world, but there was nobody committing to paper the numbers, the measurements, the standards for how to do this, how to do a complete street, how to do a bike-friendly street, how to do a transit-friendly street, how to deal with stormwater, how to make a child-friendly street. Their guidelines are amazing. So also look at their graphics too, because we're going to be doing some of their graphics, their style graphics as well. So, Janet City Khan was the transportation director for Mayor Bloomberg. Her work during that administration in terms of reclaiming public space for people transformed New York City during that administration. So the pedestrianization of Times Square is an example, but also hundreds of other smaller examples throughout the 5 boroughs of just reclaiming space that was for the automobile back into useful space. So her TED Talk is fantastic. Do check out her TED Talk. And then check out her book called Street Fight, which you can get on paperback for used paperback, pretty good. Is a great read. So she is a premier voice in terms of how street design can create space for people. This is Bud Tim Chizen. He was a MERP student in 2017. He said to me, Lauren, I haven't drawn since I was 5. I said, that's okay. So we'll teach you. So this module we used to do by hand, entirely by hand. So we got out the scales and got out the rulers and laid it out on trace. And so this on the left is the existing condition of 1 parking space on Charles Street. I think that's the one in front of the caffeinery, I think. And then his proposal for a parklet right next to the caffeinery. So, and we got out the pens and the markers, and his wife was like, he's having so much fun, I don't know what to do with him. He just wants to draw all the time now. So, at any rate, so Bud came to us from California. He was working with the homeless in Utah. He'd worked all over the West. He found us on the internet and came and did our MERP. And he was surprised that he would have to draw. But at any rate, here's some of his recent work. He now works for communitybuilders.org out of Colorado Springs. They also have a Bozeman office. He's now doing sketches of street intersections on the tablet using Procreate for the iPad Pro. And so he showed me this. He's like, hey, did you know that you can there's a mirror function now, so you can actually draw all 4 sides of a street and animate it, man. Check this out. And I'm like, and I just remember that, you told me you had drawn since you were 5 when you came to this program. Now anyway. So now he does it for a living. So great success story there. Bud rewrote our bike action plan for the city. So that was a great contribution as his master's thesis. So completely rewrote our bike action implementation plan, I should say. The implementation phase of our city's bike plan he wrote as his master's thesis. So other graphic examples are interesting because they involve computerized graphics in this overhead view, but they also include the road width and the segment width, almost like reading like it's a bar graph or an infographic. So some interesting ways of dealing with this by showing the allotment to the pedestrian, the drive lanes, and the like. That's an interesting graphic way of representing that. Lumion is a new software package that is an add-on to SketchUp, which gives you realistic materials and sun shading, so it really makes it almost look real. So that's another add-on that some of our students are starting to experiment with as an add-on to either Rhino or SketchUp. So but SketchUp is the base, but you take it in Lumion and you add the plants and trees and materials, and you can even animate them there. Jeff Tompkins, he's a 3rd-year student. He took my sophomore equivalent of this class last year, and now he's doing street realignment renderings for commissions. So he's just doing this in his spare time. He has a Patreon account and a Venmo account, and he's now already, just based on the graphic techniques that he learned in 2nd year last year, he's already starting his own business, re-illustrating and realigning streets. So he lives part-time in Muncie and part-time in Indy. So an example of entrepreneurship in action. You can literally start your own business this year if you want. Great competition called Design for Social Distancing in the city of Baltimore. It was an invited, I believe it was an invited competition. It was an open phase competition, then an invited competition. Led them to a new ideas guidebook for social distancing. direct response to the COVID crisis in terms of how neighborhoods, businesses could reactivate using their street space to survive. So that book is a download. I put that in the readings folder under our resources folder, and I think I've linked it a couple of places. But you download that ideas guidebook. There's some wonderful ideas directly attained to tactical urbanism, parklets, and centered around the idea for social distancing. So Baltimore saw an opportunity to have a competition, design competition, and then start to collect the ideas in a guidebook. And then some of the things that are happening right now, if you follow the hashtags tactical urbanism, placemaking, streets for people, parklets, parking day, follow those hashtags, you'll find some wonderful Instagram accounts and Twitter accounts that are chronicling this movement to reclaim portions of our streets. New York Times article from July, I think it was a 20-page article, but the computer animated version on the webpage is fantastic, really fantastic. And it starts to make the argument of how much space the car takes up. If you added up all the space Manhattan devotes to cars, you'd have an area nearly 4 times as large as Central Park. So this interactive web animation article is highly recommended. Farad Maju is the journalist that wrote the article, and then the firm is called PAU. That the leader of that firm is now he's now dean at Berkeley. But the graphics the animated graphics for this article are mind-blowing. So just in terms of how they explain it so well. So as I scroll through this, as you scroll through it, you come down from this aerial and you come down to the plan level view. And then each argument is made graphically. Let me repeat that phrase. The argument is made graphically. Aha. When you make these graphics, you are making an argument, just as you would if it were a legal argument or writing. So scroll through this. These graphics are really quite special. So they are made by an architecture firm and quite a bit of person power, but they made the article that much more readable and arguable just in terms of what they were able to do. So this here, we scroll down to the street view. One thing that distinguishes New York from Chicago is that where we put our trash. Yes, simple difference. New York doesn't have alleys. Chicago has alleys. Where do you put the trash? In New York, if you don't have alleys, you put it on the street. Chicago has alleys, so you don't put it on the street. It's just simple. Sometimes those simple decisions that are made 200 years ago about whether or not you have an alley or not, okay? And in New York, the lot line is from the street all the way to the middle of the block. There's no alley at all. So these things lead to part of our experience, right? Yeah.
So it's interesting that you bring up alleys. For example, in Indianapolis,
Yep.
most people park their cars by going through the alley into their garage
Yep.
because of space in there, and they
Yep.
probably put their car on the street. But they also put their trash containers out there, and the alleys are ridiculously in disarray.
Yes.
But state law and federal funding guidelines do not allow the city to put any money towards that, even though it's like almost essential, and it makes us have to put it on a lower priority.
Yep.
Even though that's how people are getting in and out of their homes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's an argument for putting prioritization back into the alley. In Chicago, there was a wonderful program under Mayor Daley called the Green Alley Movement, in which it would rip up the paving in most of their alleys and replace it with pervious paving to allow the alley to actually help drain some of the stormwater, as opposed to having it flood the alleys and back lots of houses. And so prioritization to the alley, I mean, what is typically forgotten space in cities is really something I think can be relooked at for sure. So, but there's this wonderful, here's the before, here's the after. It blends in like this. This is really nice how they blend that in. So rethinking New York City streets around the pedestrian and dealing with trash with cabinets, outdoor cabinets, or designated cubbies or things like that, so that it isn't just laying in front of every lot. You actually have to take the trash to a designated spot on your street, and then it's collected there. So simple ideas like that, but implemented citywide, of course, makes a huge, big change as opposed to the aesthetic of New York, which we know involves interacting, in some cases, interacting with a lot of that trash. But very powerful renderings in terms of how they support an argument. And interesting too that you just scroll through it. You don't have to click on anything. They just you just scroll through, and the renderings come to life. So arterials, residential streets. What does it take to move 50 people? This is actually a variance on a diagram that comes all the way from Munster, Germany, 25 years ago, this diagram. How much space does it take to move 50 people? Here's 50 cars, 55 square feet per person. One bus, 9 square feet per person. 50 bicycles. So this, when you understand that this is just about space, that same 50 people can be moved that way, or this way. The argument becomes very, very powerful. So that's a good one to scroll through. But I do love how they made this interactivity. Park Avenue, as it once was, it was a park. Duh. Park Avenue was a park. What do you know? And it could be again. So how they built the web page, how they did the renderings. This is the exact spot. So how they set that up. So this is pretty fun, how they set that up so that it's the exact same spot. So here it is currently, and how it could be again if we thought of Park Avenue as a park. What do you know? So a great article to fly through. Yeah. Now these are primarily Google Street Views, so the Google Street View is taller than eye level, right? The Google Street View camera is mounted on a small four-door sedan, so it's at about 7.5 feet. And they did it that way so they could actually see buildings over parked cars. If the camera was at eye level, our eye level, either walking level or seated at the driver level, you would only see cars. You wouldn't see any buildings at all. So they mounted the camera higher so they could see over parked cars and be able to see a building on either side. So if you're using Google Earth imagery, you have to set up the perspective a little bit different. You actually at your horizon line, you can see it's higher than eye level. So that is a difference that we have to consider if we're making renderings like this. We have to consider that, depending on what our source imagery is. So we're actually looking down a little bit at our folks here. You can see the horizon line is up here, and people are down here. So it does make for a slightly different perspective view, but with the tools we have now, the cutouts and the Photoshop technology, all that, in the Adobe suite, we can do stuff like this today. Well, at least in this unit. So, woo! Rethinking bridges. So, really great stuff. And then Roosevelt, dedicated bikeway. So that's an important article. Well, that article just came out in July. Some of that stuff was started under Jeanette Khan when she was transportation director. A lot of it stopped under the law here. And so I think the future really depends on the leadership in New York and how, and during the recovery, what is given priority. Right now, the car has been given back priority in New York, so we'll see what happens. It really depends what priorities are made. Brent Tadarian is a planner out of Vancouver. He's former planning director of the city of Vancouver. His Twitter feed has new stuff to look at every single day centered around this. So do follow Brent Tadarian on Twitter. He also has a couple of podcasts that are good that talk about this. podcasts he's done for the CBC and for other media outlets. But so follow him on Twitter and Toderian, Toderian, or Todarian. So he's someone to follow. And there's every day on his Twitter feed, there's something new to look at, just in terms of centered around this subject. And then some of my work. This is we did a Calhoun Street Fort Wayne charrette back in 2010 that just happened just after the construction of the Grand Wayne Center and after Parkview Field. That started to rethink some Fort Wayne streets. Like to think that led to some of the new things happening in downtown Fort Wayne, but that was a fun charrette. These are typical street sections that we do in my charrette graphics elective in the spring. Some that are more Indianapolis centric. Here's here's two football fans arguing. Clearly, one is not a Colts fan. But these are what we call partial street sections or quarter sections that do start to think about street space. Digitally, in Photoshop, this is a project where I actually hand drew some of those street elements and then started to create small collections of them, whether they be plants or seating elements or trash cans, lighting. So that's a Photoshop approach to this. Another hand-drawn version, this is the Bates-Hendricks neighborhood on the southeast side. In Indianapolis, the boulevards are called esplanades. Esplanades, so green space running down the middle of the street. This is late 19th century urban planning. I don't know why they're called esplanades, but that's what they call them. They had a problem. They essentially had a situation where they weren't able to conveniently park cars and have enough room for the drive lane. And part of it had to do with how much space was left over, because the drive lane, I think, is down to 16 feet. So it's very difficult to park a car and drive by a car when there's only 16 feet left. And depending on how creatively one has parked their car, cars can't pass by at all. So graphically, they needed a solution. So I drew the existing condition with all the measurements. Looking at the total right-of-way, you can see the measuring line at the bottom measures the total right-of-way from lot to lot, which in this case was porch to porch, so porch step to porch step. How wide the esplanade was, how wide the drive lane was, how wide the sidewalks were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we came up with two possible solutions. One was to widen the street, so take it all the way to the lot line. So it would involve sidewalk right up against the porch step. So you could widen the street, leave the esplanade alone. And so you go from 16 feet to 22-foot drive lane with parking. 22 feet is plenty of room for parking cars creatively or properly, and enough room for a drive lane. Does not affect the esplanade whatsoever. And depending on your funding, you get sidewalks out of it, things like that. Neighborhoods like, no, there's too many old trees. We would lose all the trees. Yes, you would. You would lose all of the older growth trees, but you would get new sidewalks out of it, new curb, new gutter, all drainage, all those different things would be replaced with this if you don't touch the esplanade. So, option 2 was to modify the esplanade and put the parking lane next to the esplanade. So you see the parked car in the middle there, and then the driving car is next to the sidewalk. It would require parking on the esplanade side, walking across the drive lane to the house. Ooh. Okay. So, but at least, it created a difficult decision for the neighbor. What do we do? Do we touch the esplanade? Because those are, some Indianapolis neighborhoods, those are sacred. This is where you walk the dog, this is where your kids play. The esplanade's a big part of these neighborhoods. But it helped them to understand, this is how much space you have, this is how much space you need, here's the decision you can make based on this graphic evidence. And so by setting the drawings up to scale, it allowed them to make that critical decision about how to move forward. Do we do nothing? Do we widen? Do we use the esplanade? And so I like to click through them quickly because what that does is almost animates it a little bit. But it does, that's my Muppet voice. It helps illustrate the choices that these people can make. Yes?
So was there any support from residents for the plan that would involve like basically taking any green space off the end of their porch and putting it in the center? Because like that seems hard for me to believe that people would
Yes.
yeah, take it away, put it out in the middle where it's public.
Right. Yeah, it depends. I don't think they ended up, I don't know what they ended up doing, but I haven't followed up with them in terms of what they actually ended up deciding. But each decision involves other factors. Right? Do we get new sidewalks out of this or no? Do we get new stormwater infrastructure out of it? Yes or no? Do we get those kinds of things? But this was not a preferred option because the idea of parking and then walking across the driveway is not. So I think basically, as they're moving forward, they're probably going for the widening, slight widening. The question too is how much do you need to widen? How wide is a parking lane? Well, it's about 8 feet wide. How wide is a typical driveway lane? About 12. That adds up to 20. Well, they had 16 to begin with, so you've got to find 4 feet somewhere. And you can do 2 feet here and 2 feet here. Or you can do 4 feet here, 4 feet there. Either affects the esplanade or affects your sidewalk, one or the other. Either way, you find the space. You find space and you make it work. So that's where the graphics came in and helped them make that decision. Other ones, this is for Norwalk, Iowa. I have a client in Nebraska that hires me for traditional illustrations, but you can see a typical collector road. I draw it in plan view, a portion of a plan view, so I'm looking straight down at the cars. And as well, you see the measuring line that shows us each of the drive lanes. There's a boulevard example, and there's other examples too, but these are very typical types of street sections or street design drawings that I provide for clients as well. Recent student work. This is last year from this unit. So this is basic SketchUp with some stuff from CAD Mapper. This is an illustration of the existing conditions of Howard Street next to the YMCA next to Mulberry. So very close to Charles Street. Charles Street is just to the left. So it's just a chunk of this property, and that's the existing condition, and then this is the reconfigured condition. So trees, bike lane, realigned parking, street furniture, and a parklet. Here it is at lower level. You can see the parklet, the bike lanes, and the parking lanes, new lighting. Another view of the parklet. Now, this would be improved by having some people, but that's easily fixed. but this is an example of someone who never used SketchUp before, and after just a few days of SketchUp training, getting up to speed and being able to do this type of imagery.